Good evening. You might notice that the lighting is a little bit different from usual. I am actually going to be practicing a talk that I'm going to give on Monday, and I want to give you sort of a director's cut, and I also want to see how this stuff plays out as I talk about it. And so this is both dress rehearsal and director's cut for these topics. The talk is going to be for an education conference. It's going to be a bunch of K through 12 teachers of Christian schools, and they are going to be asking, what does the science say about COVID-19? And when I signed up for it, I was like, I'm sure I'll have something to say about it. And it turns out that as things happened, we got a lot of things to say, specifically about what science says about education, with the topic of correcting misconceptions, because there have been a bunch of prominent misconceptions recently. So let me tell you about what those are going to look like. I'm going to tell you where I'm coming from, and then I'm going to talk about the central metaphor. The key understanding is the importance of family trees. I'm going to use the metaphor of trees and seeds to frame the talk. And that applies to most of the misconceptions that we're talking about. I'm going to have 7 misconceptions, and they're going to be related to each other. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about progress toward a vaccine. Honestly, in the non-director's cut, I probably won't get to this, but we have all the time in the world right here, so I'm going to get to it, and you can skip forward and skip past it as you desire. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a scientist. I have a PhD that I got in structural immunology from Biomolecular Structure and Design program at the University of Washington. You can see my dissertation way down there at the bottom. But of course I didn't start there. I didn't know that I was going to get a PhD until fairly late in my undergraduate career. But I always knew I liked science. Science always was a way that I wanted to look at the world. And I can trace that back to an important teacher in 7th through 9th grade, Mr. Regan, at Stone Junior High School in Florida, where I grew up. He really gave me the framework for understanding things analytically, so that the lens of science is the way that I look through and see the world. This is actually played out not only in my dissertation that I show at the bottom, but also in a book that I put together about creation, evolution, and chemistry that came out in 2016. And I must say, teachers have a huge influence, and I became a teacher myself in part because of Mr. Regan's influence. So I do want to trace this all back to him. I also have a background in journalism, which has come in surprisingly handy because I know what journalism education looks like. I know what the university, at least, is trying to get across in the university-educated journalists, which are most of them. University of Florida, I got a degree in chemistry and a degree in public relations with technical communications with a focus in chemistry. They overlap that way nicely. So all that is to say that I actually could pick either one of these shirts when I went to the University of Florida bookstore, and I ended up picking actually the one on the right. I ended up saying that the College of Journalism and Communications was the one that I want to remind myself. Sometimes I forget that I went through that education. But it gives me a lens for which, so when I critique the journalists, I'm not doing that from the outside. I'm doing that from the inside, as somebody who has written journalism. So the central metaphor, the other place that I'm coming from, is my family tree. And so you can see that I have, me and my wife, we have been blessed with 4 boys. And this is them when they were a little bit younger. They're bigger than this now, and they'd be a lot heavier. I'm not sure if I could hold up under the weight anymore of all of them on top of me. But you can see that we can express that as a family tree, and the tree gives a good example of what my family looks like. And I actually want to relate this to how things other than families grow like a tree. Viruses and the immune system also grow like a tree. The metaphor of a family tree actually applies in many different areas. Sometimes we talk about my academic family tree, which is I got my PhD under the supervision of Craig Beeson. He had a longtime collaborator, Andrea Sant, who's an immunologist. I'm still in touch with her. And Craig was taught by Hardin McConnell. So when we talk about that, we say that's the academic family tree. My biological family tree is I come from a family of 3 kids, and each of us has 2 to 4 kids of our own. So my parents have 10 grandchildren. this is actually going to become important later in the talk, and we're going to return to this, but we're going to use this as a metaphor throughout the talk. The reason why this metaphor works so well is because it is a deep reflection of the structure of creation. And I think that that's not an accident. Okay? This is reflected in many different places, including in Scripture, in the many parables that Jesus tells, which have to do with agricultural farming type metaphors. In fact, I want to use this parable right here. It's one that's overlooked. I'm not even quite sure what the name of it is. You know most parables by name, but this one, let me read it to you, and let me ask you what the name is. I'm going to call it the parable of the seed. And he said, "Such is the kingdom of God. Just as a man might cast the seed upon the earth, and might sleep and arise night and day, and the seed sprouts and increases while he does not observe it. The earth bears fruit of itself, first the shoot, then the ear, then the full grain within the ear. But when the fruit permits, he immediately extends the scythe, because the harvest has come." Even in a simple little metaphor parable like this, there's a lot to unpack. But I want to say that God prefers to create this way, at multiple levels, the human, social, and even the immunological. God makes a seed grow, its hidden life, it's patiently, slowly developing toward the light. And so one of the things this parable illustrates is it illustrates humility in the sense that it's actually overlooked. It illustrates patience in the sense that it takes a long time. And it's humility, and it's not the farmer's power that brings about the fruit. The farmer simply has to harvest it. And I want to talk about the many things that are beyond our power that we can look at and we can see that this is part of creation. Now, this is definitely director's cut material. I'm probably going to have to cut this for the big talk, but I have to say this because I have a Tolkien reference. I start thinking about how is creation like a tree, and I was thinking about how Tolkien, Middle-earth, is created with many overlapping trees at many levels. Here are 7 different ways that you can find trees in Tolkien's work, from the Ents, literally a forest marching, down to the genealogies of the elves and the kings. The languages that Tolkien invented are linguistic trees, and all the way down to, if you remember, the symbol of Gondor is a white tree. Now, the reason why this tree is so important, they don't really talk about this in the movies, but this tree is so important because it is descended from the 2 great trees that were before Middle-earth, the earth was broken and the sort of fall of Middle-earth happened. In the Eden of Middle-earth, okay, speaking metaphorically, there were 2 trees that gave light, one silvery and one gold. They were named Laurelin and Telperion. And you can get all this if you want to get nerd out on the Tolkien stuff. But the important thing about this, before the sun and the moon were, these 2 trees were. Tolkien puts trees at every part, beginning and end of his creation and going throughout. Trees are very important to Tolkien, and it was because he was a Christian and he believed that God liked trees too. He saw the beauty of trees everywhere, and he put them in, and he said that these were integral metaphors for creation. In fact, I don't have confirmation of this, but if you remember Durin's Door, which is where they go down into the mines of Moria by that lake with the squid creature in it, and remember that it lights up. Tolkien goes through and he draws that in the books. And I noticed that there are 2 trees on it. So this seems to me, this is elvish art, and I wonder if these 2 trees are supposed to reflect the 2 ancestral trees that Tolkien said side by side gave light to creation. The thing I want to bring out about this, multiple trees overlapping, working together. And I think in the same way we have multiple trees working throughout creation, throughout this COVID-19 part. So if we're talking about seeds growing into trees, you can talk about that virally, and in fact it's even more than a vague metaphor. It is a literal scientific method to understand what's going on with SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV-2 is like a viral seed. It's a bad seed, and it plants a tree, it replicates itself, and it gives off bad fruit that overtakes your body and causes these symptoms and spreads to other bodies. it has a family tree because it replicates, and we can show it in the same way that I showed my other family trees. That's the bad news. But the good news is there's also a good tree growing to counteract the bad tree going on when you get infected by the virus. So the good tree is the way your immune system grows and branches out into different branches of cells that counteract and fight off the virus. This is an example of the literal SARS-CoV-2 family tree. The DNA, or really RNA for SARS, is at the heart of the virus is actually a bunch of letters. It's a bunch of chemical letters that we can represent with a family tree of sorts. As it grew and divided, you had the grandpa virus and the baby virus and things like that, okay? And this is an example of the SARS virus tree from very early on in the epidemic. Definitely looks like a tree. It's branching off and infecting different people. And in fact, this has been a part of a much larger tree. This particular outbreak is one branch of a larger tree of viruses. As the viruses move, coronaviruses in general can infect animals, and then they can infect humans, and then they mutate and affect animals again, and things like that. So this is a wider family tree, but it's based on the same principles as comparing the RNA genomes of these coronaviruses. And the thing I want to point out about this, SARS is not the only virus on this tree that infects humans. Several of them, if you look up and down, are infecting bats and other, mouse and hedgehogs even. But if you look down at the bottom, the ones in yellow, there's 4 ones in yellow that you'll see are human coronaviruses. Each of these causes a version of the common cold. This is a very interesting thing that we will return to. SARS-CoV-2 has cousins that are much milder and cause the human cold. How does that affect the picture? So SARS has a family tree, and so does the immune system. Your immune system starts in the bone marrow, and the cells grow, differentiate, and they adapt to the new challenges, the new infectious viruses that infect your system. So you can see that there's a lot of different types of immune cells that we have here. And I want to focus on this side. The lymphoid stem cells lead to lymphocytes, which are part of the adaptive immune system. Really amazing. It's what I studied for my PhD. And what you have is you have two different kinds of cells, T cells and B cells. And the B cells make antibodies, which you've definitely heard of, right? So each of these branches, the B cell branch and the T cell branch, even it has its own sub-branches. There are subtypes of T cells that carry out, and they have different functions. So even T cells grow and evolve through their own family tree. And I say evolve very carefully, because they literally seem to do a version of evolution as they adapt to the challenges of novel viruses. So the thing about the trees, you see trees everywhere. Viruses invade cells, they overtake the cell's replication machinery, and then they produce thousands more of themselves that go off and infect other cells. Bad news for your body. And when that happens, you have the original cell being infected. It infects 2 more, makes a lot of viruses. Each of those infects 2 more. It's a branching pattern like a tree. So even within your body, the expanding pattern of virus is growing like a seed that grows through the tree. The good news I want you to remember is as the virus is overtaking your cells, the immune system is activated and it responds. In many cases, it responds really well to something it's never seen before. There's lots of viruses that you don't even know that you catch because the immune system takes care of them without you even knowing. So this is the main concept that I want to get you across. There are at least 3 different branches of immunity. And you can think of these as fast immunity, medium speed immunity, and slow immunity. Okay? And I'm going to show them with the 3 different colors. I'm going to bring this up throughout the talk. And so you have the antibodies that, if you have pre-existing antibodies, say from a previous infection, they are ready at the beginning to be activated and to come out and to quickly stop an infection from taking hold. T cells and B cells, they adapt to new things, but that takes about a week or more. You see that that's the red line on this graph, and that doesn't go up until like 5 to 7 days after infection. And we also know that months or years later, you can have T cells that respond to the same virus when it comes back. Therefore, many things you don't get infected again. The reason for that is your immune system remembers, and it remembers in the form of cells. It keeps memory B cells and memory T cells around so it can more quickly respond to infections. So there are these three branches of immunity, and the one thing to remember is as you go through these different three branches, the memory cells are long-lived. They take a long time to develop. Antibodies are faster, and they work more immediately. So that's the first part of my talk. I'm going to go ahead and see how long that took. Okay, 15 minutes. That's not bad.